You've probably never questioned it. Chicken eggs, every morning, no hesitation. Here's the uncomfortable part. Almost every bird on Earth lays eggs that are just as edible, just as nutritious, sometimes even more so, and you've never eaten a single one of them. The reason has almost nothing to do with taste. So let's actually ask the question properly. Out of the roughly 10,000 bird species alive today, why does one single species, the chicken, dominate almost the entire human egg-eating experience across most of the modern world? Because the honest answer isn't that chicken eggs are objectively superior. It's a tangled combination of history, domestication logistics, and cultural momentum that quietly locked in a choice most people never realized was even being made. Let's start with domestication itself, because this is where the story actually begins. And it begins earlier and more specifically than most people assume. Chickens were domesticated from a wild ancestor called the red junglefowl, likely somewhere in Southeast Asia, with genetic and archaeological evidence pointing to domestication events occurring several thousand years ago. What made the red junglefowl such a compelling candidate for domestication wasn't really its eggs at first. Early domestication seems to have been driven at least partly by other factors, including the bird's usefulness in cockfighting in some regions, and their general adaptability to living alongside humans. But once chickens were established as a domesticated species living in close proximity to human settlements, their egg-laying capacity became an enormous practical advantage that other birds simply couldn't match. This is the part that genuinely surprises people, because chickens aren't just convenient, they're biological outliers when it comes to egg production. A wild bird typically lays a clutch of eggs, sometimes as few as 2 to a dozen, once or twice a year, then stops entirely until the next breeding season. Domesticated chickens, through thousands of years of selective breeding, do something genuinely unusual, laying an egg roughly once a day, nearly year-round, largely independent of whether those eggs are ever fertilized or intended to hatch. This trait, continuous egg-laying regardless of reproductive need, is not the norm in the bird world. It's the direct result of humans repeatedly selecting and breeding the individual birds that happen to lay the most eggs, generation after generation, until an entire domesticated lineage existed that behaved completely differently from its wild ancestors. Once you have a bird that reliably produces food almost every single day with minimal additional effort required, you've created an overwhelming logistical advantage that essentially no wild bird and very few other domesticated birds can compete with on pure volume and predictability. Ducks offer a genuinely useful comparison here because ducks actually were domesticated for eggs as well, and duck eggs remain widely eaten across parts of Asia and other regions today. Duck eggs are, by most nutritional measurements, richer than chicken eggs, containing more fat, more protein, and a notably larger, richer yolk, which is part of why they're specifically prized in baking and cultures where they're commonly available. It's genuinely worth digging into why duck eggs succeeded so specifically in certain regions while remaining comparatively marginal elsewhere, because the contrast is instructive. In parts of Southeast Asia and China specifically, ducks integrated remarkably well into existing rice paddy agricultural systems, where ducks could forage in flooded fields, controlling pests and fertilizing crops while requiring relatively little additional dedicated infrastructure beyond what rice farming already provided. That specific agricultural synergy gave duck egg production a genuine practical foothold in exactly those regions. In parts of the world without large-scale flooded rice cultivation, however, ducks lost that natural infrastructural advantage entirely and were left competing directly against chickens on pure housing and water access costs alone, a competition chickens consistently won due to their comparatively minimal space and water requirements. Quail present a particularly interesting case because quail eggs are genuinely popular in several culinary traditions around the world, prized specifically as a delicacy, often served in fine dining contexts, pickled, or used in specific traditional dishes across parts of Asia and elsewhere. Quail are actually remarkably efficient layers themselves, and quail farming exists as a genuine established practice in multiple countries. But quail eggs are considerably smaller than chicken eggs, meaning that for the same total nutritional output, you need significantly more birds, more nests, and more collection effort. In cultures and economies that developed around maximizing efficiency per unit of labor, that size difference alone created a meaningful, practical disadvantage that chickens simply didn't have to overcome. Ostrich eggs represent the most extreme end of this size spectrum, and they illustrate a genuinely different kind of limitation entirely. A single ostrich egg is roughly equivalent in volume to 24 chicken eggs, an enormous amount of food from a single egg, and ostrich eggs are, in fact, eaten in various regions, particularly in parts of Africa where ostriches are farmed. But ostriches lay far fewer eggs per year than chickens do, and their sheer size creates entirely different handling, storage, and cooking logistics that don't translate translate easily into the kind of daily individual serving convenience that chicken eggs provide. An ostrich egg isn't something you casually crack into a pan for breakfast. It's closer to a substantial event requiring specific tools and typically feeding many people at once, which fundamentally changes how it fits or doesn't fit into everyday food culture compared to a chicken egg's convenient single-serving scale. Turkeys and geese offer another genuinely useful comparison precisely because they were domesticated successfully and remain widely farmed today, just overwhelmingly for their meat rather than their eggs. Turkeys lay a comparatively small number of eggs per year relative to chickens, and their eggs, while perfectly edible and occasionally sold as a specialty item in some regions, never developed the same continuous, year-round production trait that made chickens so uniquely suited to egg farming specifically. Geese follow a broadly similar pattern, laying eggs seasonally rather than continuously, which meant that once agricultural systems began optimizing specifically for reliable, year-round egg supply, both turkeys and geese naturally settled into a different economic role, valued primarily for meat and, in the case of geese, down and fat, while chickens quietly absorbed almost the entire commercial egg market by default simply because no other widely domesticated bird matched their specific laying behavior. There's also a genuinely important safety and practicality dimension worth addressing directly, because this is where a lot of popular assumptions go wrong. Most wild bird eggs are not inherently dangerous or toxic to eat. In fact, throughout human history and continuing in many cultures today, a wide range of wild and semi-wild bird eggs have been and still are eaten regularly, including gull eggs, pheasant eggs, and various other species depending on regional availability and tradition. The near-total dominance of chicken eggs in much of the modern industrialized world isn't really about a fundamental safety distinction between species. It's much more specifically about supply chain consistency, which becomes an enormous factor once food production scales up to serve large urban populations reliably. A wild bird's egg laying is seasonal, unpredictable, and tied to migration and breeding patterns that simply cannot support the kind of year-round, large-scale, reliable food supply chain that modern grocery stores and food systems depend on. Chickens, again because of their unusual continuous laying trait, are uniquely suited to exactly this kind of industrial scale, predictable food production in a way that almost no wild bird species can match. It's worth pulling apart the cultural momentum piece separately here too, because once a food source becomes deeply embedded in a culture's daily habits and infrastructure, that embedding becomes genuinely self-reinforcing in ways that go well beyond simple practicality. Once chicken farming infrastructure, supply chains, grading systems, culinary traditions, and consumer expectations all developed around chicken eggs specifically over generations, switching to or even meaningfully incorporating other bird eggs required overcoming an enormous amount of established infrastructure and habit, not just proving that an alternative egg was nutritionally comparable or even superior. Food culture, once locked in at scale, tends to be remarkably resistant to change, not because alternatives are inferior, but because the entire surrounding system, from farming practices to grocery store shelving to recipes passed down through generations, has been built specifically around the existing default. There's a genuinely interesting reptile and amphibian angle worth bringing in here too, because other animal eggs doesn't have to mean only other birds, and the reasons humans largely avoid eggs from egg-laying reptiles and amphibians are somewhat different from the bird-specific factors we've covered so far. Turtle eggs, for instance, have been eaten in various cultures historically, and in some places continue to be consumed today, though this has become increasingly restricted in many regions, specifically due to conservation concerns rather than any inherent food safety issue, since many turtle species have become endangered partly due to historical overharvesting of both adults and eggs. Reptile and amphibian eggs generally also tend to have a soft, leathery shell rather than the hard, calcified shell birds produce, which affects everything from storage and transport to cooking texture and consumer familiarity. All factors that made them considerably less compatible with the kind of standardized food systems that developed around hard-shelled bird eggs. Fish eggs offer a fascinating partial exception to this entire pattern, because fish eggs in the form of caviar and various forms of roe are actually widely eaten, and in the case of caviar specifically, considered a genuine luxury food item in many cultures around the world. This is worth pausing on because it demonstrates that the broader avoidance of non-chicken eggs isn't some universal human instinct against unfamiliar egg types. Fish eggs simply developed along a completely separate culinary and economic track tied to fishing traditions and seafood culture rather than land-based poultry farming, which allowed them to become established and valued through an entirely different cultural pathway that never had to compete directly with chicken eggs for the same culinary role. So the picture that emerges here isn't really about chicken eggs being nutritionally or safety-wise superior to the vast majority of other edible animal eggs available in nature. It's about an extraordinarily specific set of historical, biological, and logistical advantages, an unusually docile and adaptable wild ancestor, an extraordinary and genuinely rare continuous laying trait produced through selective breeding, a convenient single-serving size, low space and resource requirements, and in some regions, a fortunate agricultural synergy that competing species like ducks only partially replicated, all compounding together over thousands of years into an overwhelming practical advantage that essentially locked chickens into their current dominant position long before anyone was consciously comparing the merits of duck eggs versus quail eggs versus ostrich eggs at any meaningful scale. There's a broader pattern worth connecting this to as well, because this same basic story, one specific option winning out, not necessarily because it's objectively the best, but because of a compounding combination of practical, historical, and infrastructural advantages, shows up constantly across human food history in ways that rarely get examined this closely. Wheat's dominance over many other viable grains, cattle's dominance over other viable livestock in many regions, even specific fruit and vegetable varieties that came to dominate global agriculture, all followed broadly. Similar patterns of early practical advantage compounding into long-term infrastructural lock-in, rather than some ongoing process of humanity continuously reevaluating every possible food option on pure nutritional or culinary merit alone. Once you start noticing this pattern in eggs specifically, it becomes genuinely difficult to unsee it everywhere else across the modern food system. A system that feels, on the surface, like the product of careful, ongoing optimization, but which is, in enormous part, actually the product of historical momentum that quietly calcified into permanent default choices generations ago. So the next time you crack open a chicken egg without a second thought, it's worth remembering that you're not necessarily eating the objectively best option nature has to offer. You're eating the winner of an extraordinarily specific historical competition, one decided thousands of years ago by factors that had very little to do with taste, and everything to do with which bird happened to be the most convenient, most adaptable, and most willing to lay an egg practically every single day of its life. Somewhere out there, a duck egg, a quail egg, a goose egg, and an ostrich egg are all sitting quietly, just as edible, just as nutritious, waiting for a food system that was never really built with them in mind.